Q50, 37, race car. Get the fuck out of here. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Thank you very much for stopping and hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. You know I appreciate the support. Big question today, guys. Does the Infiniti Q50 VQ37 make a good race car? So this is definitely a loaded question, right? There's a lot that could go into this potentially. But first thing I want to say is that to me, anything can be a race car, because what really gets me excited is turning a vehicle into something completely different than what it was originally intended for. What I really want to do in this video is use my recent trip to the Tail of the Dragon as sort of a base point, a launching point. Give you kind of essentially a review of my experience, how this car and its particular modifications handled that driving situation, some of the things that surprised me, some of the things that I thought maybe fell short, or what we might have to improve upon to make this thing even more capable. And then at the end, I suppose you'll be able to decide whether or not the Infiniti Q50 3.7 is a capable base for a race car. So if you've been following along, you'll know that ultimately the goal for this, my Q50, was to turn it into sort of a canyon carver and ultimately an autocross car. Damn you, coronavirus! Damn you! So to me, sure, I think it is a good base for turning it into a race car, at least a race car of sorts. No. I'm not going to argue that the Q50 makes a good race car right out of the box, right off the showroom floor, right? It's a big, heavy, four-door, semi-luxury sedan that weighs 3,600 to 3,900 pounds or so. There's no LSD. There's no dual-clutch transmission. The brakes, whether they're non-sport or sport brakes, really aren't all that good. Rotors tend to heat unevenly, warp, pulse. The brake pads aren't all that great. It probably comes with run-flat tires, which have absolutely zero grip. The suspension is soft and bouncy and spongy, right? Luxury sedan. It's not all that powerful, and it doesn't make a whole lot of torque. There are certainly a few things that you can do to this car to get it headed in the right direction and turn it into a whole different beast. We've already started going down that road with this car, and if this is your first experience with the speed culture, let me just give you a quick rundown. We're currently making about 335 horsepower to the wheels, 280 foot-pounds of torque, something like that. Modifications that we have are relatively basic in terms of performance. We have the AFE dry drop-in filters up front. We have resonated test pipes and a custom catback system. Check out my custom catback system videos if you are interested, because the car does sound great. With that being said, supporting modifications: Tane S-Tech lowering springs dropped us about 1.5 inches. We have the non-sport brakes, but we do have upgraded brake pads, the R1 Concepts drilled and slotted rotors, and Concept Z Performance stainless steel braided brake lines. We have Hotchkiss front and rear sway bars, which make a huge difference. Upgraded wheels and tires. Tires are 275/35/19 in the rear, 255/40/19 up front. And then we have the Z1 Motorsports subframe bushing collars, which make a difference as well, and we'll talk about that coming up. Some other items that may or may not make a difference is the custom steering wheel by Jalisco's Carbon Fiber on Instagram. Check them out. And also this Sparco R100 racing seat. All lend to the overall performance and feel of this car in spirited and competitive driving situations. I have to admit that I was very, very impressed with how this car did as we attempted to slay the dragon. In terms of power, the car felt plenty powerful. Of course, any car enthusiast wants more power, but you know, I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy now. Well, listen, I knew we were heading to an area that could be highly trafficked by tourists and visitors, as well as have a pretty significant police presence depending on what time of day it was. I obviously wanted to push the car hard and see what it could do, but I wasn't going to do anything stupid, obviously, and I'm very, very anti-speeding ticket and paying extra for insurance premiums just because we were making dumb decisions. And I've already told my wife on a number of occasions, the first time she gets a speeding ticket, we are getting a divorce. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's just the way it is. The power that this car has right now was plenty sufficient to keep a smile on my face the entire time. I have to say that one of the biggest surprises overall had to be the Lexani LX20 tires that I have on this thing. They're super inexpensive, super budget-friendly tire, and I've talked about it before. They have no straight line grip whatsoever. We spin like crazy on straight lines, but even driving the Tail of the Dragon in the manner that I did, they held up quite well. I will say that I had traction control on through the trip because I wasn't familiar with the road. It was my first time at the tail of the Dragon. It was 41 degrees outside, so we knew the conditions were a little bit chilly and not optimal for traction. But we were pushing the limits of traction control. You can look back at some of the other Tail of the Dragon videos that I've posted from this trip and see my traction control light was flashing regularly in the corners. We were getting some tire squeal, so we were pushing the limits of the tires, but at no point did I feel insecure in the grip. Now, if we were to push the car a bit harder, and we had traction control off, would we be at that limit of the tire? Probably. So certainly I will say that I want better tires, and it's something I've been talking about for a while. But for what they are, these Lexani LX20s were a massive surprise. Another element that I was surprised by actually was these Tane S-Tech lowering springs. Were lowered about 1.5 inches, and they do provide substantially increased handling capabilities of this car, especially when paired with the Hotchkiss sway bars, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But my expectations were quite low for the lowering springs, to be honest, because we've pushed the car in the mountains before. However, the mountains that I'm used to driving in North Carolina, they're quite steep, about 2,500 to maybe 3,000 feet of elevation, and it's on a pretty dramatic grade, I would say. So going up the mountains, you're fighting a pretty significant incline and elevation, so you're not getting a lot of speed. And when you're going down the mountain, you're constantly on your brakes hard as you go into these hairpin turns at a pretty steep angle. So we haven't really been able to wind the car out in a mountain road scenario, and we've also not really been able to push hard on some of these twisty banked roads that you see on Tail of the Dragon. So my expectations of these Tane lowering springs, although there's no bounce, they do ride quite a bit stiffer than factory, although not terrible. I was thinking they would still be a little too soft going into some of these hard corners, and that we might even experience some rubbing of the tires, but that was not the case. We hit some of these curves pretty hard, and like I said, Tail of the Dragon is relatively level. There's certainly some grade and there's elevation changes, but you're coming into banked corners on a relatively level ground, which is a really, really cool experience. But I really got to give it to Tane for these S-Tech lowering springs. However, I do think we can push the car a little bit harder, and with new tires, stickier tires, and carrying a bit more speed into corners like this, I feel like coilovers are inevitable. We've talked about coilovers versus lowering springs in videos in the past, and I stand by what I've said before, which is that 99% of people driving these cars will never push their car hard enough to need coilovers. For a vast majority of people, lowering springs will be good enough. They'll get a lowered center of gravity, they'll improve the looks of their car, and they'll get additional handling in terms of performance. Unless you are the type of person that really wants to dial in your ride height or have a very specific need in terms of ride quality or stiffness, then by all means purchase coilovers. But again, a vast majority of people, you just won't need it. You can dramatically improve the performance of your vehicle as well as its look with some Tane S-Tech springs for under $200. I mean, why not? If you want to get more towards that race car status, or you want to really push the car at Tail of the Dragon, for example, or get into autocrossing, then coilovers is probably the answer, and I think that's the route we're going to have to go. In terms of handling capabilities, I've said it once and I'll say it a million times again, the Hotchkiss sway bars front and rear on this car, some of the most dramatic improvements that this car has experienced thus far. One of my favorite additions and modifications, Hotchkiss sway bars all the way. One more thing too is the Megan Racing strut tower brace. It's a cheap, inexpensive addition that you can make to the car, and it's not something you'll ever notice on a daily driving situation, or probably even notice on the twisty roads or on autocross track. But just know that any additional stiffening of the chassis that you can do when you're pushing the car hard into corners is going to be beneficial. So Megan strut tower brace, happy to have it. Now when you combine those sway bars with the lowering springs and you add in the Z1 Motorsports subframe bushing collars, it's a whole different animal. This car becomes a whole different animal. I can certainly tell after this past weekend in the mountains at the Tail of the Dragon that these Z1 bushing collars do what they're supposed to do. It's a little bit difficult actually to put into words, but it's almost as if your throttle response is improved by installing these subframe bushing collars. Now that makes a little bit of sense because you're more effectively and efficiently transferring the power directly to your wheels and tires. Now, whether or not you have the correct tire combination to put that power to the ground, that's a different story to create traction. But you really can feel the difference. It's like I said before in my review video, I feel like the tires are breaking loose more quickly or sooner after throttle is applied. That's in a straight line or around a corner. And that makes sense, again, because your subframe now is not flexing and turning. So that power is not being absorbed through those rubber bushings. It's being transferred directly to the wheels. I could definitely feel it in the hills this weekend. So I gotta say, it was a super, super positive experience. I really, really thoroughly enjoyed myself. And I gotta say too, that on my way up to the Dragon, a 3-hour drive, I averaged 27.3 miles per gallon. We ripped the Dragon apart several laps and headed back home, another 3-hour drive the following day. And when I pulled into my driveway, I was averaging over 23 miles per gallon. I cannot complain about that whatsoever. But now you say, out of all of these positive things, what possibly could I say that's negative about how this car performed? Well, let me tell you. Now, I've noticed this in other trips to the mountains, but it's something that became immediately apparent upon my arrival to Tail of the Dragon, which was the massive blind spot created by this pillar here. You know, it's not such a big deal in regular everyday driving situations, but when you are coming onto tight 180-degree turns and you have motorcycles and other vehicles coming toward you in the opposite direction, it really becomes a hindrance. You're always, and you can't get around it. You can't move your seat forward far enough to have it not be an issue, and you can't move your seat far enough back to have it not be an issue. It's always there, it's always apparent, and it's always frustrating. So you're constantly finding yourself moving your head, which distracts from the driving at hand. I really don't have a whole lot negative to say, to be quite honest with you, but I will say that I did experience some brake fade, which I did expect. Now, like coilovers, I've made the argument in the past, and I stand by it, that a vast majority of people will never drive their car hard enough to need the sport brakes. The factory non-sport brakes are sufficient enough for a huge majority of people out there, even those driving spiritedly. And I'm a perfect example of this. I've been driving for 2 years on these brakes, and now, granted, at this point I have the upgraded rotors, upgraded pads, and the stainless steel lines, and all of those lend to creating a better braking setup than a vast majority of people out there. However, on this setup, I've done many, many mountain runs. I've driven spiritedly on a regular basis. I drive spiritedly on a regular basis, and they've been sufficient. Now, the sport brakes don't give you shorter stopping distances necessarily. What they do better is resist brake fade. And now, one thing I haven't done in this car is done back-to-back-to-back spirited runs up and down a mountain, and that was the car's first exposure to this type of situation, was this weekend. So I had already made a couple of quite spirited passes, from start to finish, or from the North Carolina side to the Tennessee side and back, and then down and back, and had very little stopped time between, very little rest between. So the car itself hadn't cooled down, the braking system hadn't necessarily cooled down, and I was going for one more trip, and I really wasn't driving that hard. We had seen some police in the area by that point, but I got behind a WRX. The car pulled over for us, and he took off, and I chased. And it was fun. We were pushing it hard, and all of a sudden, there it was, some brake fade. I wasn't getting the bite that I was used to. It was almost as if the power braking system wasn't there. It was almost like I had to push extra hard to get the bite. Finished the remaining extra couple of miles of that particular lap, let the brakes cool down a bit, and they came right back. No issue. But I'll say, if we want to continue doing trips like this, which we do, and we want to continue pushing the limits of this car, I think upgrading the brakes to the sport brakes to resist that brake fade or the potential of brake fade is something we have to do. The only other negative about this trip was that we just didn't have any more time there. It's definitely worth the trip, and we'll definitely be going back. If you're even close to the area or willing to make a long trip, go. There's plenty of food, plenty of lodging, always cool cars. It's a fantastic time. I cannot believe I forgot to mention the Sparco R100 racing seat, the bolstering around your lumbar section as well as around your hips and thighs. Really holds you planted firmly in place, which is very important as you're cruising the twisty roads or participating in an autocross event. I cannot imagine participating in any type of driving scenario like that with the non-sport seats. Sport seats maybe, but certainly not non-sport. That would have been a miserable experience. These R100 seats are awesome, as are the custom steering wheels by Jalisco's Carbon Fiber. The substantial nature of these steering wheels, the girth, some might say, really help prevent fatigue in the hands and the wrists when you are in a spirited driving situation, and the additional contours and flat bottom nature of this steering wheel really help you maintain control of your vehicle, which is super important as you're heading toward a cliff. But really, to answer the overall question, does a Q50 3.7 make a good race car? Maybe not necessarily out of the box, but you can certainly add some key components and make this car a lot of fun to drive on the twisty roads and potentially on the track. Now, are you going to beat Porsches and Corvettes on a road course or at Tail of the Dragon? No, maybe not, unless you're a much better driver than those drivers, which could be potentially possible. But it's a lot of fun. It's a race car to me, and we're going to continue pushing this thing and see what we can get out of it. As always, if you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns, leave them down below. I'll get to them as quickly as I possibly can. If you don't mind, hit the subscribe button. Thank you guys very much for watching. I appreciate the continued support more than you can even imagine. Big things coming for the channel. Look forward to seeing you in the next one.